lemlisters. I'm super pumped today to be joined with the one and only Becc Holland. Becc, thanks a lot for being with us today.
My absolute privilege. I'm excited to be here.
For those who don't know Becc, she's an absolute rock star when it comes to sales. She used to be heading like sales development at Chorus.ai, and now she just launched something amazing called Flip the Script. You know that I love cold email, that I love sales, but Becc is just like a rock star. So I'm super happy to have her here. Becc, did I forget something about you, or did I did a correct?
No, that's all there is. we can close the webinar. That's all there is.
Okay, I forgot to mention something also. She has like a really nice dog in Texas, and she does all kinds of things with her, which is quite cool.
I actually forgot to say that I take her to Starbucks every morning, and we get a puppuccino, and the Starbucks drew her. They draw her on little things on the cup.
That's super cute. That's awesome. So today we're going to talk about something you particularly like, which essentially are cold email sequence. But prior we jump directly into that, can you maybe let us know a bit more about Flip the Script? Because I think it's a really cool project that you've launched and a lot of people can benefit from it.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, so Flip the Script, it really, how it started was, I had a couple of ideas that I thought of why, you know, my team or the industry in specific was struggling to hit quota and book more meetings. So I was getting some decent results, but not, you know, really overwhelming results. And so one of the theories was that you needed to personalize and you needed to know the person that you were calling to have a really meaningful conversation with them. So anywho, I played out a multitude of theories out at different sales tech companies and MarTech companies. And at one of the MarTech companies I worked at, G2, I essentially just wanted to start to get out the research and the methods of what I had been doing with the teams, because I saw some pretty incredible results. I had 4x my numbers overnight, 3x my numbers overnight, 7x my numbers overnight. And I essentially wanted to get it out to free to the community, just to give them an option of like, hey, you know, this is something that works really well for me. So I actually started it as a after hour series at 5:30 on like close to zero budget. I bought some pizza and I essentially like very like, you know, loser kid at the party that like buys pizza and is like, who wants to hang out? And I put a post on LinkedIn and I said, hey, who wants free sales training? Is essentially how it started. And I said,
nice.
Showed up at this building, and it was in the Bay Area, and started training. I did a 5-session series, everything from cold emailing to cold calling to, you know, process, objection handling, and then finished with how to personalize at scale. And so I put up the ad, and over an hour, we had 600 registrants for people that were going to show up in person. So anywho, that is how it started. And one of the SDRs of the session said I should name it. And I said, what should I name it? And they said, Flip the Script. And I'm like, sold. We're naming it Flip the Script from here on out. So that was kind of the roots of it, but it really was to get out methods of things that work to people, you know, for free, and hopefully, you know, make some impact or dent on the industry to help put it back into, you know, one of quality and one that was producing again.
That's awesome. And I guess like the pizza budget might have increased a little bit once you received the 600 applicants.
It surprisingly did it for a long time, because actually my response was I went on to Chorus, because my first company was a MarTech company, or yeah, where I started doing the series, and then I went on to Chorus to do it in a more meaningful way because they were sales ICP. And I told them, I said, I turned it into a YouTube series when I was at Chorus. Nice. 23 YouTube videos, no marketing, all organic. And I essentially, they said, do you want budget? We want to give you budget for this. And I said, no.
I want pizza.
I was like, because then I have the pressure of the ROI conversation of like, was this worth it? And how many leads? And I'm like, oh, just slow me down. So I basically grabbed a guy internally. You know, he grabbed a camera, and we stayed up there after work from 5:30 until midnight. Wow. For like a week, and just recorded all these videos and then blitzed them out on YouTube.
Nice.
So it's been a wild journey.
Oh, that's awesome. So yeah, since you talked a lot about like your training and all the things you've done, I'm curious, like, could you describe how your basically perfect sequence would look like?
Yeah, so a lot of the training that I do, oddly enough, is on process. So, you know, most of my personal belief is that most of quota attainment comes down to how lethal your process is. Now, I mean, there's several different processes across the funnel that I have a heart for. So KPI infrastructure is probably my main number one go-to of how are you measuring marketing? How are you measuring sales development? You know, are you measuring marketing against an MQL? The MQL is just anyone who downloads content, regardless of whether they're a
Yeah.
current client or hit ICP or are the right title, et cetera, you know, and then your sales dev team doesn't want to call on them because, you know, there are a whole bunch of leads and then you're tracking that across conversion. So I'm like, you know, there's one bucket of problems that I had seen. The other side is the sales side. When you hand over a sales opportunity, you know, like what is an SQL and what is an SAL, and are we qualifying them according to ban? And we've got a whole lot of subjective opinions, you know, from AE to AE on whether something's qualified because it's on some like muddy criteria.
Yeah.
It's not just integration stack. It's like, is there a need kind of thing? And so most of my work actually started with process, but from a tactical perspective, even there, I lean towards process. So, you know, my most heavily, I would say dug into, or the concepts where I dug in the most was from a, you know, I'm like, hey, I can come in to this training and I can jump on the phone with your reps and I can, you know, teach them how to handle the objection, not interested, or I'm running into a meeting, you know. However, you know, we're getting on average, the average activity metric is 40 dials per day via Topo research. And it says 45 via Bridge Group research. And you get 3 to 4 connects off of the back end of that. So I'm like, okay, so let's say out of those 3 to 4 connects that I take you from, you know, I give you some objection handling thing and it takes you from 20% conversion to, you know, arguably, let's say coaching, it's like you get to like 25 or 30% conversion because of this coaching and this principle. I'm like, so we went from, you know, out of the 4 connects per day, I went from whatever that is, like a half of a meeting per day is scheduled to 0.75 of a meeting per day is scheduled. And I just didn't see the way out of like, hey, programs want results and they want them now. And so that comes down to, I'm like, I have to do something a little bit bigger than teaching them some kind of hook. So most of the process that I ingrained was, you know, if I had to limit it down to what's a quote unquote silver bullet, you know, in terms of what can work for outreach, it's like personalize, you know who they are, include that information, hook it to relevance. So most of the sequences that I've built are all, oddly enough, I'm based on attribution source. So basically, like, is this a content download, or is this a webinar registrant, or is this a high value MQL, or is this someone who viewed my website? And I'm personalizing on the back end, but most of the sequences themselves, they're shell sequences, you know, that has a structure of language where you add the egg.
Okay.
You know, and so there's 5 emails, 10 cold calls, and a LinkedIn research step on the front end where you tease out 3 personalized premises, throw it into your, whatever engagement vendor you're using, and go from there.
And do you also use like some LinkedIn messaging in it? Like, do you pull in, yeah?
So I really, when I've heard social selling, I've heard it diagnosed to 3 things, like social selling in terms of, am I putting out content that creates inbound interest? Number 1. Number 2, am I using LinkedIn as a medium to reach out? And number 3, am I using the information on LinkedIn to infuse my other channels? And I err towards the latter. You know, if like use the information on LinkedIn, but really infuse the other channels. I don't know if this is just in the US, but I've certainly noticed a trend where decision makers are upset with you adding them and then pitching them.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm like, people are getting really, really upset. And so I wanted to keep that into play. So we did do light social as a medium, but it was after, at the very end of the sequence of like, you have gotten to know them, you've commented on some stuff, maybe you've liked some posts, like you've sent over meaningful outreach beforehand, because you run the high risk of, even if your pitch is good, you know, that the person gets upset from that. So I try to use it really as a data warehouse of things to talk about, but much less the former of using it as a channel.
Nice. And you were talking actually about personalization and also relevance, which I think is super important. So how exactly, like, where do you find the information? Because you mentioned like your first step is usually like LinkedIn research. So I guess like LinkedIn is a good source, but
Yeah.
what type of information do you find? And also how do you scale it? Like, do you have very specific example you could share?
Yeah, so I mean, personalization and relevance, the difference between the two as defined, from what I've read is personalization is by definition one-to-one, whereas relevance is one-to-many. So you can segment users based on a premise. So how I'm intertwining the two, essentially, I have limited down personalization to really 4 types of buckets of like self-authored content. Did they write an article? Were they on a webinar like this one? Did they write a post? Engage content? Did they like, share, comment on someone else's content? And these are in order of how likely you are to get a response. So self-authored, you're going to get the biggest hit from what I've seen based on the data with my teams. Engage content is number 2. Number 3 is self-identified traits. So their company line, headline, profile line essentially on their page. And then the 4th is what I would attribute to junk drawer, which is basically like, mutual connections, recommendations, schools, personal interests, hobbies, etc. But how I'm intertwining those is I'm telling my reps to pick 3 of those in the context of knowing they're going to have to hook whatever they pick to our value prop. And so they start to get really creative of how do you hook someone liking Starbucks to whatever sales training. And it's like, you'd see them come up with all these great ideas, but from a relevance perspective, and it's been interesting because I've gotten coined in the industry from what I hear of like, oh, well, she's personalization girl, and is she relevant? And I'm like, well, time out. She came from relevance, right? So relevance wasn't working for me anymore. And from what I've seen in the industry, it's just not effective anymore. Like, you don't get a VP of sales over at Oracle who opens a mass blast template, regardless of how good the value prop, essentially the value prop is, unless his buyer intent or her buyer intent is just super high. So, from the sequencing perspective, I am sequencing, and I have 57 sales plays that I'm using a one-to-many premise. Like, I noticed that you downloaded content, or I noticed you attended this webinar, with Becc, et cetera. But more importantly, and then I hook in a personalized premise of like, I saw you wrote this article on X, Y, and Z, and then hook it into relevance in terms of their buyer persona in the middle.
I actually think that's super interesting, and that's really what I liked about your approach. Is like, because a lot of people talk about like personalization and finding icebreaker. Like at Lemlist, we call them like tiramisu because we find them sweet. But it's basically like the intro line that you're gonna make to hook your prospect. But what a lot of people forget is the hook between this and your value proposition. Would you have like some good example like you could share? Between a good intro line and let's say link to a value proposition in a smooth way?
Yeah, so I can give you 3, but it's a great point, because I think people see personalization a lot of times as like, oh, well, I'm telling them like, hey, I noticed you went to Texas A&M.
So what? Yeah, exactly.
Like, or hey, Becc, I noticed that you're struggling to learn French. So what? Like, unless that
Thank
matters
you.
in the conversation, it's like, oh, thanks so much. Yeah, my French is crappy. I really appreciate
Have a
it.
good day.
Thank you. Like, it's just bizarre. And they're like, hey, this increases engagement. Your prospect is just as smart as you, right? So they're wondering whether you're full of crap or not, so to speak. And where you prove that to them, to me, in the breadth of it, is in the middle of the line of like, hey, yes, you did this thing, and I'm bringing it up for a very valid reason. So the 3 ways that I really do it, the hook line, so to speak, typically for me has 3 parts. The first part is I'm tying 2 to 3 words from the excerpt of the personalization of like, you wrote this article, one line that stood out to me was X,
Okay.
and I'm 2 to 3 words in there in a rearranged fashion. And a lot of times I'll bold them, of like, whatever, personalization, snowball, like however you're going to intertwine them.
Yeah.
The last part of the sentence, I basically put and blank as a result, and put their main buyer persona, what they're metriced on.
Okay.
So drive more quota attainment as a result. And the middle part, I basically traverse my way back from the 2 to 3 words to I state a leading indicator of essentially what would drive that leading or lagging indicator of what would cause that business impact. So great example would be, let's say there's an article on like, oh, scaling effective teams, it all comes down to quality conversations. What if you could ensure that your reps over, at lemlist were having quality conversations with your prospect, driving more conversion and booking more meetings as a result. So I'm really looking at that infrastructure for the first email. And I'm starting it with, what if you could, I have an idea on how you could, and imagine if you could, for that line. If I don't have an actual excerpt, like I'm hooking on concept, like they went to a school, and essentially I do a prep line where I do what I call, like laying the grips of, like, whenever you're, rock climbing, you have to lay the grips. And so I start a statement before that hook line that say, I noticed that you played basketball over at Stanford. I'd imagine that being successful at Stanford comes down to practice time and skill, and then I say, what if you could ensure whatever your reps have the skills that necessary through practice and repetition on their cold calls, so you get the math. But essentially I have a prep line if I'm hooking on concept. And the great thing, to your point, is like, you can lay the hook, you can lay that statement if you're hooking on concept wherever you want. So it really becomes a game that you can win.
That's really cool. Before we actually talk about, right now I'm going to make a little a teaser about Jennifer Aniston drinking beer and the push and pull technique. So wait for it. I've got a question from the audience. So guys who are watching us, just for the one who are joining late, I'm with the amazing one and only Becc Holland from Flip the Script. She's dropping some value bombs, so you're going to enjoy it. Make sure to drop a like and also ask your question in the comments. We have a question from Lucille. She's asking, how many days would you recommend between follow-ups in your sequence? Because you mentioned kind of the structure and number of calls, but we didn't really talk about the timing.
Structure, yeah. So essentially for a shell sequence is what I call this, to incorporate personalization, where you have the structure of a message, but they're adding in the egg, so to speak, in certain points. I basically, every sequence of mine, or most sequences of mine, are 16 steps over 21 business days.
Okay.
And the LinkedIn research step is first. And I do 5 different pods. All of them are very similar, meaning there's an email and 2 cold calls per pod. Okay. And the first email cold call pod is basically day 1, 1, and 2. So I research, and then I send out the email, and then I cold call that day, and I cold call the following day. And I based in terms of when I was doing what actions and how aggressively, on research from a guy named MJ Hoffman. He's the author of Why You Now. And he did some pretty extensive research on what was the cadence of actions or sequence of actions that you need to do. So, I mean, keep in mind, this research was done, a little bit ago. So I would always compare this to my own experience. So usually when I hear a third-party trainer or someone say something, I'm like, it might be true. I'm going to try it out in my day-to-day and see if it actually works for me in my business. So I would always, warn people to do that. But essentially his research proved that you should be easier in the beginning in terms of the amount of touches, and more aggressive in the end. Because if you're aggressive up front and you peter off, you're teaching your prospect, number one, you're all up in their face all of a sudden. And then you're teaching, especially if you don't have personalized messaging, and then you're teaching them that if they just wait long enough, essentially you'll go away. And so he posited that you should flip them. You essentially should be, lighter on the front end and get to know them, and then be more aggressive in the back end. So the 5 pods that I do are on day 1, 1, and 2 for the first pod. The second pod starts business day 8.
Okay.
So it's day 8, 8, and 9, cold email, cold call. And then the next pod starts on day 13. So I'm getting exponentially quicker, and it's cold email, cold call. And then it's the 4th pod, if you will, starts on business day 18. So I go cold email, cold call, breakup email, and then we're done. And so I saw a lot of conversion on that back end. And keep in mind, most of the messages that I was sending are personalized. So by the end of the sequence, they're like, oh my gosh, this person is obsessed. I have to respond. But that worked really well for me and my teams.
Nice. And have you like A/B tested different sequence? Maybe one that's a little bit, could be like a bit less pushy, or depending on the target, testing different approach?
Yeah, so I had tried everything under the sun, meaning,
Okay.
you know, as a student of the game, I had, and again, I always look at third-party research as like, okay, this is an aggregate research of a bunch of different companies. So we're talking different value props, different industries, different, and we're pushing at all these vendors to give us relevant data of like the 3 words that will work. And it's like, well, the more that you make it generic, it's like the harder it is to give any kind of advice that will help you drive conversion. So that's why it's hard to get a post to go viral for good reasons. It's like you essentially have to hit a positive common denominator for a big group of people when they have very, very big, you know, different backgrounds. So I had approached, I had done everything from 4 emails to no, you know, all email, all cold call, you know. But in terms of aggression, to your point on aggression, I have never, since I've been doing personalization, I'll tell you kind of an anecdote, but I have never had prospects that were mad.
That's great.
So they usually get mad when you're mass blasting them and you don't.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But if you're being relatively properly aggressive, is what I call it, being aggressive about the research, and then you're calling them a couple times, they think that you have conviction, you know. So I had a rep come up to me, you know, when I was at Chorus, and he was like, "Can I talk to you?" And I'm like, "Walk and talk, baby." Like, you know, I'm on the move. And so he said, "Yeah." So I called to this gentleman today, and he hung up on me, and I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he's like, "Yeah, so he hung up." And I'm like, "Oh, Chris, they're going to do so much worse to you in your career." Do so much worse. He had never been hung up on, and he was brand new to sales.
Okay.
And he had not incurred that, you know, result because he was personalizing. So I will say, in terms of aggression, you earn the right to call them, from my perspective and from my experience, more whenever you know something finitely, because then definitely, like, oh, low key, this person's obsessed with me. So, much different action.
But also, I think, like, for me, I guess, like, I receive tons of cold emails, and basically, like, the one that I reply to are the one that are personalized. But I still think that there are maybe like 99% of cold emails that are not personalized. Some people ask me like, "Hey, Guillaume, would you love to join our dev team?" And I'm like, "Man, I'm a CEO, you know, like, I'm not a fucking developer. Like, stop, you know, like, this is really." So when I see all the bad personalization out there, I'm like, okay, it's a huge challenge educating people. But something you said that I really liked is, because I see a lot of people, like a lot of sales rep in our community, we talk a lot about, you know, like rejection and how to handle rejection. But what you mentioned and that I really like is, like, if you spend time personalizing your approach, you own the right to get and reach out to that person. For me, it's because if you like deeply feel that that person would benefit from your service, then there's no reason why, you know, they should like hang up on you. Maybe they will do it, but at least, you know, you can do it on a sequence and feel more confident about it.
Yeah, I recently heard a podcast where basically there was a CEO of a decently well-known company who had put a rep on blast, and they had gone on LinkedIn and been like, "This is bad outreach." And then someone else in the community got super mad, heated about it, and was like, "You shouldn't put that person on blast, and who are you, blah, blah, blah." They go on a podcast together, and I listen to the podcast, and, you know, person B is mad and is like, "Why did you do that?" And the CEO is like, "Yo, like, we actually have a need for this thing. So my problem isn't that they were blowing me up. My problem is that, like, they didn't even know the data they need to know to sell me, and I'm a CEO." And I'm like, you know what? Okay, do I agree that you know, CEO should have put the person on blast? No. My perspective is always like, you know, if you don't have something nice to say, just keep moving, you know, keep moving. It's just a waste of time, etc. You know, but I'm like, her point is valid. Her point is valid that she is a CEO of multi-million-dollar organization, And it's like, I think if you're reaching out to someone, certainly of that caliber, which if you're reaching out to decision makers, the right person, like you're reaching out to someone who's done some very interesting things in their career. And I think it's an unbelievably missed opportunity.
Yeah, definitely.
Know some data on them. And so the biggest, argument against is like, well, we can't scale it. And I'm like, okay, well, industry average again is 40 dials. And I had my reps at 60 dials. So let's take 40 dials as scale, because when people are sending out templates and doing the mass blast, no one's talking about, can you scale it? So I'm like, let's take 40 as scale. And I'm like, I was close to doubling that with still personalizing. Yeah. So I'm like, let's put the result aside for a second, because I'm like, apparently we don't want to scale results, in the industry for some bizarre reason that I don't know. But I'm like, I see the point, that it was bad to put that rep on blast, but I'm like, you know what? She had a very, very extremely valid point that she'd been blown up 25,000 times by the same company when she actually had a need for their product, and they just had to do 5 minutes of research to say, you're running this campaign, you took it better with X, Y, and Z. And so I definitely think it's a missed opportunity, to your point, for reps to at least just stand out right off the bat. Like, stop sending the gifts, stop sending the silly, pattern interrupt of like acting like a clown. Just research for 30 seconds and figure out who they are, and you'll be okay.
That's we have another question actually from the audience. So Nadia, she's actually from our team. She's a huge fan of yours. She's asking, how do you keep track of conversations happening across all different channels?
Yes. So I'm assuming that she means, how do you keep track of email versus cold call versus...
So, for example, like I think we're still talking because we produce a lot of content on LinkedIn, and I guess you too. So it brings a lot of inbound like conversation. And I guess it was the same for both Flip the Script or when you were working at Chorus. So whenever, you have people reaching out on LinkedIn, essentially like sometimes, they're going to be, hey, Becc, I was checking your profile, just check you were working at Chorus. How exactly do I get in touch with you about the product? Looks interesting. And how can we make that happen? So how exactly would you track it in your CRM and basically manage all your channels?
Yeah, so social is the hardest to track, and it's the hardest to monetize, and it's the hardest to pull in, just because that's what, LinkedIn was fighting to provide a network. So I think they make it relatively difficult to turn it into a spam engine, which makes sense. In terms of how to track it in the CRM, you can, when you're sending someone an in-mail, basically click a box that says copy to my CRM. Disclosure, if you hook up your account, if you get Sales Navigator and hook up your account, I have seen it where it tracks all of your LinkedIn conversations.
Oh, nice.
So careful. You might be talking to potential employers at some point. So just very careful. But, LinkedIn from a activity metric standpoint, it's difficult. You would have to basically hit that copy to CRM, and if you have a pre-existing relationship with the person, then essentially like you aren't sending them an email, then there is no option to copy the CRM. So you'd have to do it manually, which I think I'm like, I'm always fighting for my reps of like, hey, I need visibility, but not at the expense of you sending 2 messages instead of 20. So like, just go do your thing. But in terms of how to track their different sources, so I was, again, building a sequence for every single source. So if you have an aggressive inbound, it's like, okay, we got content downloads, webinar registrants, event attendees, et cetera. And I think from a operational perspective, I think what I was doing at Chorus was more interesting than the personalization piece of, we had built in automation. And I worked with John Sweet, if he's watching this, absolute genius. And we collaborated very, very deeply. But essentially, one of the biggest pain points I had as an SDR leader was list cleaning of like, who are the people hit ICC and are the right company and are the right title and aren't a current customer, and spending time to do that. So we set up automation rules to where if they hit the company size that we wanted to sell into, and they hit the actual title in terms of buyer persona, in terms of discipline, and in terms of level of like, I went director level and above, it would clean that away from the list of content downloads who didn't hit that. And it would send to the account owner of like, if I own these 20 accounts, it would send to the right owner. And for the people who did hit ICC and did hit ICT that weren't owned, they piled into another sequence. And I had a postbound, because I call those postbound leads, postbound unowned team that would call on that list specifically.
Okay.
You know, and then I was ranking for my reps of like, I mean, we're in the weeds, but this is, I think this is the main engine behind it. You know, content download, webinar registrants, event attendees, you know, website views, high value MQL, buyer intent, you know, and then you've got all your outbound, you know, reasons that I wouldn't bore people with, but, you know, customer executive churn, you know, they use course and then they moved on to a different company, or people who requested a demo but didn't schedule one, or, you know, they have a relationship with your VC, et cetera. I was sequencing all of those. And then I was, from a data perspective, understanding what was the most important sequence, meaning, you know, high ACV, close one ratio, booked meetings, small amount of steps. What was my most immediate sequences, and what were the easiest, meaning, you know, maybe marketing put the leads in there for me. And I was re-ranking for my reps every single month. I said, don't fall in love with the sequence names, fall in love with how to count. So you just come in and you have sequence 1, sequence 2, then you move to sequence 3, 4, 5, and I'll dictate the, meaning I'll take the brunt of the when and the how and the who and all that, and all you have to do is basically come in and trim the 3 premises and hook them together. So very nerdy stuff, but
I
the
really
operation,
like
it just sped us up like 4, 5, 6x. So turned it into an engine that we could actually use to win.
How many, like, oh, 2 things. Just before we jump to the next question, you had like mentioned ICC and ICT. Can you just elaborate on this?
Yeah, so I, from a marketing view, when I would talk to marketers, I'd be like, okay, so you have all these MQLs, and they're like, yeah, we sent over 10,000 MQLs last week. And I'm like, okay, you know, half of these are Gmail addresses. Let's put that issue aside, which doesn't mean they're unqualified.
Yeah, definitely.
Give you a personal email address. I'm like, let me be very clear. Mark Benioff has a personal email address, and so Mark Zuckerberg. Are they unqualified? Absolutely not. All that tells you is essentially they didn't want to give you their information. Yeah. So, you know, from the MQL perspective, I had seen people gating and counting against their tally of like, hey, I had 10,000 people in this webinar. And I'm like, okay, great. But when I trim out all the current customers, you know, because we're going lead gen only, current customers, people who are already in sales cycle, you know, people who don't hit ICP, you know, then my list goes down to 250 out of those 10,000. And I was remetricing marketing from a KPI perspective, like, hey, 75% of your KPI is on brand awareness. So it's on the 10,000 number. 25% is on how many people, you know, did we want to sell into that we haven't currently already. So the main problem with ICP as defined, ICP, you know, it means ideal customer profile for people who, you know, on the line who haven't heard of it before. But essentially, I would see marketing teams, you know, that I worked with across the industry basically saying like, oh, they were only including company, you know, and they were saying like, hey, company and how much content this person had downloaded and how relevant was the content. So I'm like, that's great. But that gives me an intern over at Oracle who has downloaded a lot of my stuff. And if I'm successful in booking that meeting, my AE is pissed. And you're telling me that the solution to this problem is that I need to call them more? I'm like, it's an intern. So my mind was blown. So I'm like, okay, we're going to come up with new terms. ICC means ideal customer company.
Okay.
Employee bandwidth. This is, you know, whatever's important to you, integration, you know, industry vertical, whatever you want to define it as. And ICT is title. So I have 2 pieces of title of like, are you in the 5 respective buyer personas that I sell into? So Chorus, for example, we sold into sales leaders, SDRs, or sales development leaders, RevOps, you know, revenue leaders, and sales enablement. So I'm like, are you one of those disciplines? And then also, are you a manager level or above, or are you an individual contributor? So I'm not, mad that people who are, individual contributors are watching the content at all. It's like it causes groundswell. It's very, very beneficial. But from a marketing view, I'm not going to give you points on the board for getting a bunch of individual contributors. Because again, if my team calls into them and they book that meeting with an SDR, my AE is going to not only disqualify it, but he's going to talk crap about me on the Slack channel. So I had broken it down to, of like, okay, we need to think about title. And the more interesting thing about the marketing, piece of it is they would say, like, we're going to measure ourselves on pipeline. So this person's from Oracle, so it's worth $1 billion of pipeline. Yeah. I'm like, it's an intern. It's an intern. And not that no disrespect. I was an intern. Everyone was an intern. But at this stage of the game, this is not someone who has buying ability of like, I felt like I was blacking out when I was talking to the marketing team. Sometimes I'm like, like across different companies. This isn't just, certainly not just companies that I worked with. I'm like, hey, you're telling me to call on this lead. This is my grandmother out in Wisconsin. I can call her 800 times. She is not going to buy. She got confused that this was a tracking software so she could find where my grandfather is, not that she has to buy an SDK that could track marketing campaigns. So I'm like, most of the work, I was trying to just logic up the funnel and say like, hey, the reason the sales team is mad and the reason they don't call in any of the leads is they think most of these leads are bad. So, and they're wrong. They're wrong. There are a lot of good leads in there. So I just, from an automation view, need a way to segment, kick out the people that we don't want a meeting with, and then bring these, people to deck of like, hey, marketing, I'm going to give you a reprieve. Sales is hard to deal with. And it's like, so let's clean up some of the issues here and say like, you're doing an incredible job. This is a KPI thing. This is not your fault. This is our fault for not setting the right KPI of like, let's set the KPI of this person needs to be someone we need to sell into. I'm not going to ask you to set the meeting. I'm not going to marker you on pipeline. I just going to marker you for bringing to deck the people that we want to talk to, and we'll take it from there and be on the line for being accountable to book the meeting. So long tangent, but I think from an ops view that's
definitely important.
Major.
I before I actually like jumped into like the question from the audience, I kind of did a little teasing about Jennifer Aniston drinking beers. So we had a few people like asking more for it. So Becc has come up with.
Probably I'm drinking from the amount that I'm hyped up right now. I very rarely get hyped up. I think you just asked the right question.
So yeah, I really enjoyed like listening to you when you mentioned about that little anecdote. So can you let us know a bit more about the push and pull techniques and approach in cold emails?
Yes. So I essentially in the food industry, there is something called the bliss point. And the bliss point is the balance, the perfect balance between sweet and salty that drives food addiction for people. So, think about peanut butter or Nutella of like, there's some sweet and there's some salty in there both. And so people, in the nutrition industry, study what that point is for people so that they can drive people to want to know more. So in terms of just people in general, we gravitate towards someone who is extremely balanced of like, they're very, very strong, but they're nurturing as well. So, I've seen a lot of different times where someone who typically doesn't cry, who's a very strong, like man, let's say, gets on stage, and when they shed a tear, everyone loses their mind crying because they know this is typically someone that's very, very strong. So I strive for, in my outreach and in my daily life and in my, within my character, a balance between two seemingly opposing positive attributes, and how do I intertwine both of those into my life. So when I usually would talk to my reps, I'd say like, hey, the image of Jennifer Aniston drinking a beer, do you like that image? And they're like, yeah, I like that image in my head. And I'm like, well, why? They're like, well, she's typically, you would see her as someone who's very fit, someone who works out all the time, probably eats very healthily, vegan, yada, yada, yada. I don't know all the buzzwords. You're getting a glimpse into my nutrition level. But like,
we're not going to talk about egg white and turkey at 11 p.m.
Let's not talk about eating in bed, which I do every single night right before I fall asleep, and then just drinking straight caffeine all throughout the day. So I'm like, you think of Jennifer Aniston, you think of someone who's eaten salads and kale and, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like when you think of the image of her drinking a beer, it makes her more personable and it makes her more relatable because you're like, I drink beer, even though this is someone who typically doesn't do that. So, I think about someone who doesn't typically go out, and then they're like, oh my gosh, this person's actually going out. So this is a big deal. So how that boils down to sales is when it comes to a CTA, I'd seen a lot of advice of like, hey, be very aggressive, like ask for what you want, go after the meeting, etc. And then I'd also seen the counter advice of don't be aggressive. Don't ask anything. Just ask like, is this relevant to you? Send over content and ask, is this relevant to you? And to me, the perfect CTA is a balanced one. Of one where very, very, in the former case of you're super aggressive, the person, they're like, oh, it's a yes trap. I don't want to say yes. This person's going to ignore me in the sales cycle. When I tell them no, they're going to keep going, etc. But the latter case of where I'm just like, is this relevant to you? Or, I just wanted to send over some content. A lot of times people, they don't know what you want. They're like, okay, thanks for the muffins or whatever, but like, who are you? And like, what do you actually want? So to me, the perfect flavor is a balance of, think of like an iron fist in a velvet glove. So how that boils down in the CTA is I do something what I call the push-pull. If I ask for exactly what I want of like, hey, if you give me a shot Wednesday at 2 to unpack how VPs of sales leverage, flip the script to drive more quota attainment, pipeline, and close more deals, I promise, I won't blow you up with follow-up if you're not impressed. And then I say either way, or in any case, or regardless, or at any rate, and I incorporate some language of like, hey, a big fan of your team, keep the good articles coming, and let me know if I can be of any help, or this is a good place to intertwine COVID language of like, I'd seen reps do it at the front and they're like, hope you're safe during these uncertain times and your children are well, and everyone, they're like, it's just disingenuine. So they're like, okay, they see it as pattern recognition and they want to, they close down the email. So I pivot that to the back end and say like, especially if you're personalizing, you're talking about someone's work. And if you're talking to someone, it's like you or me, it's like, if you say like, hey, Becc, you don't look that great today. I'm like, okay, whatever.
I will not say that.
If you say like, I don't, it like, if you're like, I don't like your approach, or your approach didn't work for me, I'm like, it's like you ran over my dog, or you blew your nose in my fictitious wedding dress. Like, I'm upset, So it's like, if you're talking about someone's work, in the front end of like, hey, you wrote this article, you want to convey to them in the last end of, even if you don't, I want this thing, I want this meeting, I want this, close one deal. But either way, I value your work,
You're removing a lot of pressure from the person also.
Bingo. It's like, take out like diffuse it in the last line. And that did some pretty impressive stuff to our conversion rates of like, they're clear what you want, but then you're like, either way, keep the good articles coming. I hope you're staying safe with everything during the pandemic, and let me know if I can be of any help, etc. And it just changed the tone and the feel of my emails to where I felt like it was more human.
Something I really like about your approach is, and you mentioned it a little bit here, it's the language. Like you mentioned, like either way. And then there's also another thing, which was using imagine instead of what if. Do you have like other example like this that you could share, that you see people like using type of language that could actually, by changing one word, make people feel less pressured and probably like help them build better relationships?
Yes, there's one that stands out to me, and I do a little bit of a session on it, but I call it the not to switch, and it's I'm putting it top of mind because I think it has helped me in a lot of conversations of saying like not to be the person that lectures for 15 minutes and doesn't ask you a single discovery question, or not to be the pushy rep that double emails you, or not to be the person that goes on too long here, or not to be the sales rep who tries to enforce my deadlines on you when you don't care, or not to ask 15 minutes of discovery questions, but I have one more question and then we can, when all you wanted to see was a demo. And that really took the heat out of the conversations and proved to my prospects that like, I'm self-aware, I know what you're thinking, and I'll get that has been a godsend to me in terms of, I would say push-pull and the not to switch. I use it all the time. And I call out what they're probably thinking, the best guess in the room. So, I also use a technique I call elephant in the room, where I try to pair those two together of like call out what I think is actually happening behind the scenes of like, I don't know if it's just me, but I get the feeling that you're going to go with my competitor. Or, I would say someone says like, hey, I'm running into a meeting, and I'd be like, can I level with you? I've been hearing send me an email a lot recently, and I get the feeling it's your polite way of saying, go away, you annoying sales rep. You're never going to read the email. Did I get that right? And like, you'll hear these prospects just break down laughing, and they're like, yeah, you caught me. And then all of a sudden you're out of that toxic, what I call other car mentality of I view you as the other car on the road, so I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to ask you to send me proposals. I'm going to do all terrible things to you because you're a sales rep and I don't trust you. So you exit out of that other car mentality, by basically saying like, not to be the annoying sales rep who hammers you 7 times with cold calls when you're probably just trying to gear up for Thanksgiving, but I had this thing where X, Y, and Z, and it enabled me to basically call out the elephant in the room, win rapport with them, because they know that I know what they're thinking, and that I am self-aware. So I'd say those are my tips that changed my conversation to where every conversation is almost a conversation with a friend.
Would you use it like as this not to be like a sentence? Would you use it like in the essentially like beginning of the email, for example, or would that be something you use at the end?
It depends. I use it all the time.
Okay.
Conversations, anything. Like I use it all the time, even as a closer. But I would use it where I've used it before is when I'm going the common VC angle, for instance, and I say, hey, reason for my outreach is I notice, that you're Bessemer invested in you and also in us. Not to be the cheesy sales rep that says, hey, we have common VC, want to buy my stuff? But I also saw X, Y, and Z, and people's reactions are just
it's awesome.
So bizarre. So I think most people, it's like you'll see these reps want to strive to have that level of relationship, and so they think, and it hurts my heart. They think that how they do that is by being silly. Like I'm going to send you over a list, or be jokey, or like dance on a video, or sing to you, and I'm like, wait, hold on. Keep your cash in your purse. Like, you can keep your integrity and your dignity, so that you don't have to dance for them. You don't have to dance for anyone, but be different. So I'm like Coco Chanel, my favorite, probably one of my favorite quotes of all time is, she said, to be irreplaceable, one must always be different. So I'm like, be different.
Number 5.
Be different. Yeah, number 5. Exactly. In French that I can't understand. So I'm like, I think we need to strive to be different instead of, sending over gifts to a senior vice president over at Twilio. It's like, you might make them laugh, but you're not on the same level as them if you do something like that. So I would try to empower my reps by being like, don't let them walk all over you, but you need to be the one rep and the one conversation that they remember because of how different you were in that conversation from anyone else that they've ever met.
No, that's really awesome. Like time is flying like crazy, and I know like your time is super precious. Do we have time for one question or?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So there's a question actually from someone who want to know more a bit your top tactics when it comes to research. We discussed a little bit about it, but when you research, for example, if you don't find enough information on the person, like let's say no real actions on LinkedIn, no posts, no comments, would you jump like to the company, and how would you research company or accounts, for example?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So personalization is tough. It is, you
Yeah.
know, it's tougher than just being quote unquote relevant. But, you know, as all good things are,
Yeah.
right? All good things are tough. That's arguably what makes them good. So I have seen and the reason I couch with that is I've seen a lot of people, you know, myself included, and reps that I've worked with say like, hey, well, I went there and there was no low hanging fruit. And I'm like, well, there's very rarely an article that talks exactly about what you're talking, like what you're selling. So I would push my reps, you know, into those top 3 buckets of self-authored content, engaged content, or self-identified traits. So self-identified traits is company line, profile line, headline. And those, even if someone's not active on LinkedIn, when they signed into LinkedIn, they wrote an about me section.
Yeah.
So that's usually the bucket I would use for, you know, for someone that literally had no activity. And I mean, you know, no. So I spent every single week a session with my reps, and it would bring profiles that they didn't know the angle to go. And I would show them within 60 seconds
Nice.
the angle that I would go. So I'm like, hey, I'm okay. I'm like, the reason that I'm tough on them is I'm like, I know those are the buckets that work.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm viewing it as like Apollo 13, you know, whenever they were like, hey, we need to build a filter. Here's the stuff on deck. How are we going to do it? Not, are we going to do it? You know, so I'm using personalization because, you know, relevance by and large isn't working anymore. You know, just relevance standalone. And so I'm like, I am aggressive to find something in those first 3 buckets. But if someone truly has nothing, then I would resort to, and again, like even personal interest in the junk drawer, it's like they put what school they went to, they put what clubs they're a part of, you know, et cetera. They don't have to be super engaged. But the 5th bucket I do is company level data. And so that I do any like about me section, M&A, blogs, post hiring, and I would click on the company, go to LinkedIn. They usually have a big description on all the great things that they do. They're in their website language. It's like I can find something in that bucket. But I will say, full disclosure, really company level data is irrelevance because it's one to anyone who works for that company. So you're going to see your lowest trigger rate there. So I would tell my reps like, hey, 85 to 90% of the time we're staying in buckets 1, 2, and 3. Otherwise, I'm going to triple your activity metric, because not because I'm mean, but because you're going to need to triple your activity metric to actually hit your number. So I would push people to get innovative and be like, you know, I related GDPR to conversation intelligence once. It's like, you know, and they really like the approach. So really it's just a fancy pattern in a rep. Now there, I will say, full disclosure, and then I'll be quiet. There are a couple of cases where I wouldn't use personalization as a strategy. So to all my haters out there who say like, well, you shouldn't always use it. I'm like, yeah, a few cases. If you're B2C,
Yeah.
Okay. If you're selling to farmers, okay. If you're selling to doctors, like, let's be smart here. But most other cases, you know, I like, again, the math is there. So I usually, you know, push people in all of their cases, like, unless you're selling to farmers out in Texas about agriculture products, like, you know, they're probably not on LinkedIn, arguably, but most people, you know, it's like they're on Facebook, they're on social media, kind of thing. So anyhow, I don't know if I answered the question, but
Yeah, definitely. No, that's awesome. Like, thanks a lot, Beth. Really, like it was amazing having you here. I know you told me like just before the start of this live that you're handling like a webinar soon.
Yes.
Can you let us know a bit about it? Vuk from my team will put the link in the comments so you can check it out.
This is going to be what I think is like the biggest webinar of my career. So I said it on LinkedIn and people are like, whatever, Becc, you know, like here she goes again. But this is going to be truly the most exciting, comprehensive content that I have ever done. So I'm like, personalization at scale was here. To me, this topic is here. So it's going to be the comprehensive encyclopedia of sales plays. And so I'm going to go into 57 sales plays that are commonly used by orgs, how to structure them, how to put messaging into them, and how to figure out from a data perspective, which are the best plays, for you and your org and your situation, because every org is different. So yeah, if people would go to that webinar, so it's going to be 90 minutes, it's free. And I'm going to kick people a PDF after the session that you will walk away with a PDF of like every play under the sun that you can run. So it's like, you know, I can pick a myriad of these. Some of these I'm going to have available. Some of these aren't going to make sense, but it's like, you know, I spent months basically in the tank thinking of any kind of play that I'd ever heard of or ever been mentioned to me, regardless of the good, bad, or ugly. And I'm going to, you know, unpack them, show how to sequence them, and show the strategy from a one-to-many, one-to-one, how to incorporate personalization and where to do it and what you can automate. So if people are interested, I would love it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm sure our audience will really love it because from the quality of the content, guys, if you didn't know Becc now, I guess you know that she's dropping a lot of golden bombs. If you still don't trust it, or if you just arrived a bit late, you can just go check out her website, Flip the Script. Then you will understand the level of the quality. And then again, Vuk just put in the comments the link of the webinar where you can register. Highly recommend it. Becc, thanks a lot for being with us. It was really awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. I honestly had a blast. It was great.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a lot.